Hello, everyone. I have with me Naren and Nicolas. We're going to talk about getting around Europe. But before we jump into it, I'm going to ask both Naren and Nicolas to very quickly, very briefly describe what your companies do. Naren.
Start. So I'm
By the way, it's Naren's first time on a really big stage, so please be nice to him.
Thank you. So I'm Naren Shaam. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called GoEuro. We're 3.5 years old, and what we do is bring most of transportation in Europe under a single platform. So you can search trains, buses, and flights. So we work in 12 countries today. We partner with most of state-owned rail operating companies in all these countries, and about 500 buses and BlaBlaCar as well. In 12 countries, we have about 10 plus million users a month. 70% of them are mobile, and we basically sell millions of tickets for people from 120 countries.
That's right. Nicolas?
Yes, I'm Nicolas. I'm co-founder and CEO of BlaBlaCar. So I guess the way to describe BlaBlaCar, it's kind of a long-distance carpooling network. So the way it works is pretty simple. As a driver, if you happen to drive between, let's say, Paris and Brussels, you would go on BlaBlaCar and say, hey, I'm driving this Friday at 6 p.m. from Paris to Brussels. I have 3 empty seats in my car. And you offer those seats to passengers going the same way.
Right.
And as a passenger, you just go on BlaBlaCar, you book a seat in someone else's car, and you end up traveling between Paris and Brussels, last minute, low cost, and with like a very fun, very social experience. So to give you a sense of scale, today we operate in 22 countries, so all over Europe, Russia, and some emerging market, like Brazil, India, and...
How many of these 22 are in Europe?
Sorry?
How many of these 22 are in Europe?
So it's mostly Europe, I would say. Outside, I mean, depends how you define Europe.
Right.
But we outside of Europe, we operate in Russia, in Ukraine. We also operate in countries like India, Turkey, Mexico, Brazil. So it's pretty wide, it's pretty global at this stage. And to give you a sense of scale, we're talking about a community of 40 million people growing pretty fast. And from a transport point of view, from a usage point of view, you're talking about over 4 million people using the service every month.
And if I understand correctly, there's no profit motive for the drivers. If I'm driving and I have 3 people coming along, they're splitting my fuel, but I don't make any money, right?
Yeah, so the basic concept is based on sharing, right? So as a driver, it's a trip you would do anyway, and you would typically do with an empty car, right? So you're going to do this trip between Berlin and Munich or between Paris and Brussels. You have 2 or 3 empty seats in your car, and then you're going to offer those seats and share the cost of going between the 2 cities with 2 or 3 passengers. So it's not a profit-making activity. Right. It's not about professional driver. It's just about like matching a math teacher, a student, and a plumber that you want to drive between or want to travel between Berlin and Munich and match them together into a car.
So I think what we're going to do today is we're going to stay focused on Europe. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about. It's very easy to get distracted. So I think what we should do, stay focused on Europe. And let's talk specifically, or let's start off with, so there's a lot of focus on intra-city transport, on intra-city mobility. But getting between cities remains a bit of a hassle, even in a place like Europe, which is incredibly well connected. There's a lot of competition. There's a lot of providers. Why is that? Why is it that in such a densely connected place such as Europe, there's still room for people like GoEuro and BlaBlaCar?
Yeah.
So I guess, yes, there is a lot of focus on inner city mobility, like food delivery services, Uber, car sharing services, etc. But that doesn't mean that people are not traveling between cities. People travel between cities multiple times a year. The access to information for traveling between cities is mostly nationalistic, and within each country there's multiple providers. The underlying technology that brings together all of this data has never been standardized. The same way, you can search a flight on any website from Buenos Aires to Sydney and you'll get maybe different prices, but you can book a flight. But you can't do that on trains, buses, and...
There's nothing integrated.
There's no integrated platform. There's no availability of information. It's a lot more dense, so it makes it more complex. Every country has roughly, one airport to about 300 to 400 train stations.
Right.
So it's so much more dense in terms of access to data.
And everyone has a different system of how they do it. There's different fares, there's peak and off-peak and discounts. And
Correct.
sort of bunging that all together must be an incredible challenge.
Correct. So, for example, station codes are different in every different train company. You mentioned it. Fare types are different. UK alone has 21 train operating companies. They don't have all the languages. Payment methods are different, unique. Some tickets are not sold online. You can only buy at the station. There's passes. So it's while infrastructure in Europe is actually superb, it's the availability of information for consumers to just say, I want to go Paris, Amsterdam, click 2 buttons, and then board that train. It's fully mobile. It's simply not happened.
And you integrate BlaBlaCar as well? Is that what you said earlier?
Yes, we partner together, yes.
So you can, if I go on GoEuro, I can
You can book a
look for a train fare, or I can find out.
Yes.
Yeah, in a way, we're doing 2 very different things, right? I guess what Naren is doing is just aggregating all the different means of transport you could have to go from point A to point B and all the multimodal solution. In a way, we are one solution, right? So we're not like an aggregator of multiple solutions. We are a solution, right? Which is like booking a seat in someone else's car. And the thing that's, I guess, our approach and what's interesting for us is if you look at mobility in Europe between cities, right? So if you look at trips between 100 kilometer to 600 kilometer, 80% of that is actually done by car.
Oh,
so
right.
we tend to think that people travel
In Europe, that's really surprising, actually.
No, it's huge, and it's something people don't understand or have never thought about. But most people travel between cities by car, not by train, not by bus. So the car is still like the most used mean of transport all over Europe. Same thing in the US, same thing in emerging market. That's the mean of transport we use the most. So our approach is that today and even long term, the best solution to go from point A to point B, and that's going to be highly granular, is actually the car, right? So today, if you think of BlaBlaCar, we connect big cities like Paris and Amsterdam, like Munich and Berlin, but we also connect like thousands of very small cities that today are not connected by rail or by bus or by anything else. And we just enable actually cities to be connected very effectively, very efficiently in terms of time and price that were not connected before.
So it's more of a sort of proper network than a hub and spoke system, which is the traditional means of public transport.
Yeah, to some extent, what we do is like it's a people-powered network because people often ask us like, how do you make sure you have cars going to the Alps during the winter or to south of Spain during the summer? We don't. People just go there.
You have no control, right?
It's all community-driven, and people go wherever they want to go, and the network is very flexible.
In a sense, actually, the supply provides itself, because if there's certain places people are interested in going at certain times of the year, they're already going there, and then other people can go along.
No, absolutely. And to give you a sense of, we look at this data, but to give you a sense of that, we today, just in France, right, which is like for us the historical market where we started, and today where we have the biggest community, we have 100,000 routes in France. 100,000 routes, which is far more than any bus network or train network. Meeting points in Paris, so places you could go and pick up a BlaBlaCar from, we have over 2,000 pickup points in Paris. So it's like having 2,000 train stations or bus stations. So the nature of the network long term becomes a lot more point-to-point, a lot more granular, and a lot more powerful.
Have you done any research on how, you said 80% of trips in Europe between 100 and 600 kilometers are done by car. Have you done any research on what percentage of those trips are done by single occupancy cars?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So if you think of it, so it's roughly 80% of trips between cities in Europe, so 100 to 600 kilometers done by car. The car occupancy on this trip is 1.7.
I see.
Right, so now if you think like in terms of like seat capacity, it means you have 2.3 or 3 seats available, so empty seats in cars.
Capacity.
Yeah, so by far, it's the biggest seat capacity in the world. But when I say by far, it's like a factor of 10 to 50 compared to any rail or bus network, right? So that's what we tap into, and I would say today we're still like scratching the surface in terms of potential of like unlocking those seats, so that other passengers or drivers that don't want to drive end up booking those seats and traveling together.
That actually brings us very nicely to the next point I wanted to bring up, which is both GoEuro and BlaBlaCar. You don't work in competition with existing services, but you make better use of existing capacity. Naren, you provide ways for me, sitting in London, for example, to figure out how to use a Czech railway system. There's already cars traveling around, and you provide ways for people to use them. Tell me about sort of how you figure out the infrastructure of it, though. There's all these trains, there's all these buses. There's 600, 1,000 different systems. How do you bung that all into one search?
So that is basically what we do. So ideally, I mean, we start with basic contracts, so you get all of this access to data.
So you have to go and talk to companies.
Each one of them separately. There is no platform, there's no global distribution like Amadeus or Sabre that has stitched all of Europe together. So you get access to all the inventory. So today we have access to about 550 rail and bus companies in our system, so we have the largest inventory. And basically on top of this underlying independent technology, each buses may have their own technology platform built by a small, either in-house or an engineering company next door. The rail systems are very complex. If you think of it, going back to the network, you know, there's roughly 5,000 to 10,000 train stations in each country. So roughly about 50,000 train stations in Europe. Times 50,000 train stations, there's 2.5 billion potential combinations. So not everything is transported, not everybody takes every single route, but you can just think of how many routes you can serve to consumers in terms of stitching this information together.
So what is to stop somebody else from doing the same thing? What is the sort of competitive advantage? So why can't I start a company, hire a bunch of people?
Of course, anybody's welcome to start. I think the complexity is getting access to data is hard. Second is building technology is not a job of 2 or 3 engineers. So we have 100 plus engineers just building our backend platform. And then making the data normalized, because all of these APIs don't respond quickly. So you're talking in the world of a consumer where you want to buy something on Amazon, you click one button, it's shipped in 24 hours. You want to get a taxi, you press a button, it arrives in 2 minutes. And then you want to buy a train or a bus ticket, and then it takes 15 seconds to load. It's slow, it's complicated, etc. So we're moving an entire industry that's worth about 150 billion, just Europe alone, to something that is really so simple, where you just press, I'm going from, Madrid to south of Spain, like you said, any location, and then you just get your best trips. You press a button and you just board the train. So the underlying technology is what allows users to travel more on these, because it's simple. The fact travel is also very emotional. So if it gets hard, people get very emotional, and if the train is late, people get emotional. So it's one of those things where technology can truly change how people travel more.
Okay, but here's the thing, Naren. So you work with these companies, you're not in competition with them, but so I remember in 2014, I was taking a summer holiday in Central Europe, and the train from Zurich to Milan, if I booked it with the Swiss railway company, it cost me 3 times as much as if I booked it with the Italian railway company. The difference is, the Italians insisted on posting the ticket to me to an Italian address. So I had to find somebody there to get the ticket, etc. But when you show up and you say, look, we're going to find you the most efficient, cheapest route, don't the Swiss say, hang on a sec, we could be charging a lot more, but then GoEuro is showing up and charging them the Italian prices. How do you deal with that sort of thing?
This is part of the complexity we deal with. What you're talking about is the same train that is code shared between 2 different rail companies.
It's the same train,
Yes, exactly. It's the same train that's probably sometimes a Swiss rail, sometimes an Italian rail, and it's code shared only on that route. But when you go beyond that route, you can't book on the Swiss rail system an Italian train, and the other way around. You can't book domestic Switzerland on the Italian rail system. They don't allow this. So the train systems don't talk to each other. They only talk on that specific few trains, and this happens only on a handful of cross-border trains. So largely, most of the inventory is not accessible on the other train system. So for us, we just make simple rules in terms of, if it's fully domestic, it's very easy for us because you pick it from the Swiss rail system. If it's cross-border, we just have business agreement that says, depending on where you go, where you originate, we pull. But sometimes our prices are much cheaper than both. That very much happens.
I mean, so in the absence of information, in the absence of competition, companies thrive on being able to, if you don't know that you can get something cheaper, they can make more money. But then when somebody shows up and flattens that out, isn't that also a threat? I mean, I know you say you work with them, but in a sense, you're also a threat to them.
Absolutely, but if you look at our goal is to grow the pie bigger, right? If you look at any country, if you're going from Zurich to Milan, and you're sitting in London and searching for that, and if I can sell you that ticket to Swissrail, it's a fixed cost business. The trains are running anyway. Everything that I sell come from you to them is purely margin for them. Right. So it's basically economics 101 in terms of distribution. Do you need distributors? Absolutely. Can you always be, can you reach every consumer all over the world with your existing brand and marketing presence? Never. So basically, how much distribution can we bring them? How complementary it is to your existing distribution channels, etc.
And I think the point here, I mean, both companies, whether it's GoEuro or BlaBlaCar, I think we increase mobility, right? We enable more people to travel. And one point we have not made is how the landscape and regulation essentially have changed in Europe in just a few years, right? So if you go back like 5 years ago, never mind 10 years ago, the only way you could travel between cities in France or in Germany was either you take your car or you take SNCF or Deutsche Bahn, and it was like a state monopoly, and you had nothing else. Within a few years, you go from like lots of different rail companies operating in the country, lots of different bus companies and BlaBlaCar. So suddenly the possibilities for the consumer have increased. There are lots of things you can do very effectively you could not do before, but the complexity has increased. Right, so when the complexity increases, you tend to have like services like GoEuro, like many others probably, that will sort of like take on that complexity. Exactly, something is gonna sit on top and simplify that for users. So it's probably going to drive like lower prices as well. Right. But I think that the main point is going to drive like a lot more demand, and people are going to start like doing journeys, doing trips that they were not doing before because they didn't know, because it was too expensive, because there was no transport network for that.
Tell me something, Nicolas. Have you faced any pushback from train companies, bus companies, these sort of mass transit providers in any of the countries in which you operate?
Yeah, so to your point earlier on competition, we don't really think of competition all that much, right? So the challenge of BlaBlaCar was more, how do we create a new behavior? How do we convince drivers that it's okay to actually share your car with 2 or 3 people? Right. And initially, if I go back in time, when we first described the company and described the concept, people thought it was crazy. People told us like, it's never going to happen. People are never going to share their car. If you get like 100,000 people to use your service, it's a miracle. People don't do that. They don't trust each other. Right. So over time, we had to create this community, create trust, so that suddenly it's okay for you as a driver to offer your seat to a passenger, because we gather enough information about people, enough context, enough trust information, enough peer reviews between members, so that it's okay. You have this trusted network. To the point where today it's like 40 million people actually doing that and growing pretty fast.
But what about from SNCF, for example, or any of these, like an established train provider, an established Euro lines, for example? What's the German one called? Mein Bus? I don't know. Have they had problems with you?
No, so there are 2 points on that, right? One is a lot of the BlaBlaCar activity actually comes from routes where essentially you have no train, no buses, right? So we don't even compete on those routes. And when we ask our passengers where do they come from, you have a mix of response, right? So some of them would tell you, yes, I would have taken the train, or I would have taken the bus. So there we might overlap on the passenger side. Right. But lots of them tell you, A, there was no option. B, I was driving my car, then I'm not driving my car. And for us, that's the biggest pie. Right. Again, 80% are people using their car. That's what we want to disrupt more than anything else. And sometimes they tell you it was too expensive. So because BlaBlaCar is so much cheaper, I travel more often between Paris and Brussels because it's 20 euro, not 80 euro.
Exactly.
And
especially,
so you create demand.
Also in the UK, the trains are outrageously expensive.
So the second big point is regulation, actually, where because we based everything on cost sharing, we don't have like the issue of professional drivers making a profit. It's just about like the 3 of us sharing a ride between whatever Paris and Brussels, and sharing that cost. And as long as you do that, you have no regulation problem, no tax problem, no insurance problem. So we've been able to scale in many countries without like regulatory pushback.
So, Naren, Nicolas, both of you, we've talked quite a bit about how lovely it is for people to get around and communities and information. But how do you guys make money?
It's very simple for us. So we basically take a commission on every ticket we sell.
From the
provider. So from a consumer standpoint, you should basically have all the choice in the world, which is transparency of information, simplicity of the product at the same price as what you would have got from each of the operators. and then we charge a commission. So it's a very straightforward business model for us.
And so it's a scale business. The more you sell, the more money you make.
It's the same. It's exactly the same concept for BlaBlaCar, right? So in that sense, it's very similar to Airbnb or most marketplaces where people transact through the platform. So if you offer a seat at like 10 euro, I'm going to pay on the platform. I'm going to pay probably 10 euro plus like 10, 15% of commission fee. And that's where we add services. Typically, we add like additional insurance and other services in the fee. But the more transactions we get, the more usage we get, the more GMV we generate. So that's what's being transacted, and the more revenue we generate as a company.
So it's very straightforward on both sides.
What's also interesting is the volumes also drive efficiency in the system. The more we sell, the technology becomes better. Our routes get more, it's a very dense network. So the routes get better optimized, the accuracy of pricing gets better, latency reduces, we have better understanding of inventory systems, we know seat availability, we can do better pricing. So there's a lot of efficiency gains with scale that comes with, I think both are business models really.
Yeah, no, that's what we, I mean, clearly what we see, it's very interesting because for us, the service is getting better and better as you go, which is not always the case. I mean, lots of
B2C is getting better and better. Just
so I'll
more
tell you in a minute,
density.
but lots of B2C services tend to get worse as they scale because you become supply limited. Like you don't have enough drivers or cyclists to deliver food, and it gets tricky because you're limited by supply. For us, it's kind of the opposite because it's a true C2C marketplace.
Right.
And essentially, what happens is the more people offer rides, the more people book rides, the more pickup point you're gonna have, the more timetable you're gonna have. So again, I was saying like today in Paris, we have close to 2,000 meeting point pickup location you can take a BlaBlaCar from. If you look in a Friday evening, going from Paris to Brussels, you can have a car leaving every 5 minutes.
Right.
So
every
if
5
you
minutes
think of
there's
that,
somebody going.
and the more people we have, the more timetable we get, the more location we get, and the service gets more and more granular, right? So
I see we have 3 minutes and 35 seconds. So I'm going to skip my fourth point altogether and jump directly to the last one. It sounds to me like both of you have a pretty good sense of where business is going, how people are moving around. But do you have a sense of how people will be moving around in 5 or 10 years' time? Are there sort of major changes or just more efficiency?
I mean, I think it'll fundamentally change. People call us a multimodal travel platform. It's a complex trade word that we use. It basically means you have access to data or access to tickets, journeys from more than one mode of travel, whether you compare 2-3 modes or whether you combine 2-3 modes. But what's interesting is people are already doing multimodal travel. From here to Helsinki airport, is it cab, a bus, and then you take a flight, and then you're going to London, you have Gatwick Express, which is 19 pounds or 20 pounds on top of the flight, which is probably just 40 euros on EasyJet. Yeah. So people are already doing multimodal transport. I think in the future, multimodal, for me, is the norm. People are already doing it. The ability to buy these tickets in a single click will change the way people consume. Today, the responsibility of buying these each legs is the responsibility of the consumer, just because data is not synchronized, and it will get more and more simpler as technology brings most of this data together. There will be increased competition among providers because there's a lot of deregulation happening in Europe, both within train companies, between buses and trains.
So are you thinking maybe sort of bundling them all together and then offering you a door-to-door ticket but discounting it, that sort of thing?
So basically the value to the consumer is the choice and the simplicity of actually able to combine any two things or take one with just one click of a button. So there's, I think, a huge upside in kind of how consumers travel today. Both the route I already know, I go to the station, stand in line and kiosk for 10 minutes and buy the ticket, to something that's basically more complex. Everything should be more efficient. I don't know if it'll be on a mobile device or some sort of device that will transact where you just speak and it completes the transaction. But all of this require normalization of data, simple products. And I think this will change the way, just like Uber has done, right? You don't think of taking a cab until you step out and then you decide, okay, I'm just going to Uber it, or
Citymapper for that matter. I mean, it used to be a lot more complicated to find your way around big cities, but then Citymapper says, take this bus till here and then the tube from there.
Exactly. You're sitting in Berlin on a weekend and you just say, okay, I'm free this weekend, and you say, oh, there's a price, 20 euro BlaBlaCar to Prague, and okay, fine, I'll just click a button and you hop on it the next minute and you're in Prague. So
What do you think, Nicolas?
Well, the thing we're pretty excited about actually for the next like 5, 10 years, and I don't know if it's 5, 10, 15,
Remember, you have 39 seconds. So
it's what's happening with the car, right? So if you look at and we talked a lot about like autonomous car, self-driving car, it's going to change, and it's going to change pretty fast, right? So I don't know if it's 5 or 10 years, but I think what's going to happen, given 80%, again, like 80% of intercity travel is done by car, when the car is going to become increasingly self-driving, increasingly autonomous, what's probably going to happen is private cars are going to increasingly going to become public transport, right? They might be privately owned, but people are going to share the car more and more.
Right.
So if you think of like what we do, our job is to put like 3 or 4 people together into a car so that they share the cost of driving that vehicle. And in a world of increasingly autonomous cars and self-driving cars, it gets pretty exciting, right? Because your cars are going to go anywhere.
They're going anywhere, yeah.
And I think the long-term play actually will see that most people, the biggest mean of transport we'll see is going to be a shared car, a self-driving self-car. And that's probably going to happen in an horizon of like 5, 10 years.
Great. As you can see, we're 30 seconds over time, so we should probably call it a day. Thank you very much, Nicolas, Naren. It's been a fascinating chat. Thank you, everyone, for listening.